My name is Andy, and today I will be exploring the question, how can early childhood education spaces be better suited to address trauma? This is a particularly important area of trauma to examine in the context of early childhood education. This is because infants, toddlers, and preschool-aged children experience, quote, a disproportionate amount of abuse, and the resultant toxic stress during this rapid developmental stage is more damaging than it is in later years, end quote. It is important for teachers to learn about trauma and for schools to prioritize addressing it, especially in early childhood settings. This is because, quote, most children who do receive mental health services are first identified and provided services within a school setting. Therefore, teachers and staff in schools are the first line of defense for children with trauma, so they must be knowledgeable about childhood trauma and trained in approaches to manage it. Now, let's delve in further to the effects of childhood trauma. I will be focusing more on the general effects, and we will discuss the effects on education later. Trauma makes a huge impact on a young child's development. In fact, Fredrickson says that, quote, infants and preschoolers with trauma are in some ways comparable to children with disabilities due to their developmental limitations. As these children grow, there are many implications for their future due to the effects of trauma. For example, they may struggle in school and they're more likely to have mental health issues and chronic illness like heart disease. Furthermore, they're more likely to face incarceration and employment issues. They are also at an increased risk for substance abuse disorders. They are even more at risk for human trafficking. Additionally, there are generational implications. Fredrickson writes that, quote, biological evidence of a family history of abuse has been identified even in the second generation of non-abused children. Child abuse is also learned behavior from one generation to the next. Approximately 1 in 3 survivors of child maltreatment go on to abuse their own children, end quote. Part of the reason for all of these effects is toxic stress. Quote, toxic stress is the exposure to unremitting or cumulative trauma that results in a prolonged activation of the body's stress response and is more harmful, even catastrophic, to children than to fully formed adults. This toxic stress is harmful to the developing child unless mediated by positive interactions and attachment to caring adults, end quote. All of the effects described previously are amplified if trauma occurs before the age of 6, especially in regards to toxic stress. Additionally, abuse is more prevalent in children of this age. Fredrickson writes that, quote, a child's highest risk factor for maltreatment is being under 4 years of age, followed by being unwanted and having special needs. Most of the deaths from child maltreatment, 74.8%, involved children under age 3. A study in Indiana found that over half of the neglect cases in 1 year involved infants and children under 6. Of substantiated sexual abuse cases nationally, 1 in 5 were children under the age of 6, and 2 out of 5 cases of physical abuse were with children under 6. A retrospective study of 14,776 subjects reported that 1/4 of caregiver sexual abuse happened before school age, with a median age of 8. To be frank with you, these statistics are horrifying, and it only gets worse the more you examine the issue. Children from ages 0 to 6 may not be able to express what is happening to them, or they may not even be able to speak yet. Furthermore, quote, they are most likely abused by a parent or caregiver while being completely dependent on their parents for safety and survival. As they age, their risk for parental abuse decreases, end quote. Because of this, it is critical that early childhood educators are prepared to deal with trauma survivors when these children may be spending prolonged time without their parents for the very first time. This is especially important because of the barriers young children face in receiving trauma-informed care. One of the best treatments for trauma is evidence-based treatment, or EBT. But there are very few EBT options for children of ages 0 to 6. Furthermore, children who reside in homes with substance abuse or domestic violence may not be identified by their caregivers as in need of behavioral health services. The schools they attend may be the first place where they receive any services for their displayed behavioral issues. Farmer, Burns, Philip, Agnold, and Costello, 2003, reported that most children who do receive mental health services are first identified and provided services within a school setting. End quote. Let's discuss how traumatized children are identified. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey is often used, and this is abbreviated into ACE, or sometimes just ACE. This arose from a study in the 1990s examining how childhood trauma could affect adulthood. They found that, quote, the higher the number of ACEs, the greater incidence of negative outcomes, end quote. The ACE pyramid captures this. The ACEs survey is a, quote, rating scale-based screener for trauma exposure that may be amenable to school-based administration. However, the Trauma Sensitive Schools Organization discourages this. They say that, quote, it is not appropriate or necessary to screen all children in an attempt to identify which ones have had traumatic experiences. This can further stigmatize students who may already feel alienated and potentially cause more harm. The best approach is to ensure that trauma-sensitive learning environments are provided for all children, regardless of whether an individual student is known to have a traumatic history, end quote. Additionally, this would create a culture of trauma sensitivity rather than just providing trauma care on an individual case-by-case basis. Early education spaces are best suited to intervene in early childhood trauma. This is because, quote, students spend a large percentage of their weekdays within the classroom. The school holds the next natural level of responsibility, after caregivers, for students displaying the cognitive, behavioral, or academic effects of exposure to a traumatic event, end quote. Furthermore, trauma-informed care programs at schools can teach skills for dealing with trauma to staff, children, and parents. This allows the, quote, trauma-informed environment to be integrated in all parts of the child's life. This is important because, quote, building a healthy and safe relationship between the child and caregiving system can buffer the impact of traumatic stressors, end quote. Thus, this creates a more successful intervention than if it was an approach isolated to just one part of the child's life, as it is with most therapy interventions. Because early childhood trauma affects a child's development, it also critically affects their education. For example, Brunzell and Associates, 2015, found that individuals who had lived through adverse childhood experiences were more likely to have been suspended or expelled, failed a grade, have lower academic achievement, be at significant risk for language delays, and be assigned to special education, end quote. Furthermore, a 2012 study, quote, revealed significant differences in reading, math, and science achievement scores among students exposed to trauma and those without exposure. In all three academic domains, students exposed to trauma scored significantly lower than students with no exposure, end quote. Social skills such as self-regulation and awareness of how others are feeling may be especially impacted. Bilbrey et al. Says that this is because these skills are usually learned through interaction with parents, who very well may be the ones who cause the trauma in cases of abuse, and it may be an unsafe relationship. Furthermore, early childhood trauma may manifest as disruptive behaviors in the classroom. If the child's teacher responds through frustration or punitive measures, for example, this may serve only to re-traumatize the child. Therefore, the educator's role in trauma sensitivity is very important. Largely, teachers tend to feel that, quote, implementation of trauma-informed care within schools and training for educators is lacking, end quote. This data comes from Bilbrey et al. Study, which surveyed 218 elementary school teachers. The majority of teachers agreed that the school needs to support students in trauma care, but, quote, when asked if they had the knowledge necessary to meet the mental health needs of their students, only 28% of teachers agreed, end quote. This lack of confidence is concerning because, as previously mentioned, if a teacher responds incorrectly to trauma, it can worsen the problem. Therefore, it is critical that schools focus on supporting teachers' learning through professional development and policies. Furthermore, trauma-sensitive schools write that schools must come together to be trauma-sensitive and move, quote, away from the typical paradigm in which classroom teachers have primary responsibility for their respective students to one based on shared responsibility, requiring teamwork and ongoing effective communication throughout the school." End quote. They also advocate for education reform to ingrain trauma sensitivity in the school system itself. Now, let's discuss what trauma-informed care actually is. Trauma-informed care is like an umbrella term. Frederickson defines trauma-informed care as, quote, "an overarching concept designed to address trauma in a systemized way. The goal is to improve prevention, treatment, and outcome for affected individuals in order to reduce the prevalence and impact of trauma." End quote. Because of the broadness of the definition, there are some misunderstandings about the concept. Some people think that it simply means knowing what trauma is and the effects it may cause. In actuality, trauma-informed care is much more than that. It is an approach that believes all areas of society should be informed on trauma and work to recognize it, treat it, and prevent it. If all systems of a society work together regarding trauma, we will be better able to help intervene in cases of early childhood trauma and abuse. This is important because there are so many problems arising from early childhood trauma, as discussed earlier, and, quote, "abuse is enormously harmful, costly, and widespread." The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, has 6 guiding principles for trauma-informed care. These are: 1. Safety, which includes ensuring the school is a safe place, both physically and mentally. For example, an administration that doesn't tolerate bullying is part of this, as well as ensuring staff do not respond to disruptive behaviors with punitive measures such as suspensions. This may sound obvious or unnecessary in early childhood education spaces, but as discussed in Part 1, quote, "children in preschool have expulsion rates 3 times higher than youth in K-12, end quote. 2. Trustworthiness and transparency. 3. Peer support. This includes not only students, but staff as well. 4. Collaboration and mutuality. This includes collaborating with organizations outside of the school who do trauma-informed work, such as therapists in situations requiring that type of intervention. 5. Empowerment, voice, and choice. This means the focus is not on the child being broken or needing to be fixed, but rather on their perseverance and empowerment. 6. Cultural, historical, and gender issues. This means recognizing generational traumas and structural inequities such as racism, sexism, and more. There are many benefits of trauma-informed care, including that, quote, "following implementation of trauma-informed approaches, schools have reported 30 to 90% reductions in suspensions and between 20 and 44% reductions in office referrals," end quote. Now that we have a general understanding of trauma-informed care, let's explore some specific models. Quote, "Trauma-informed elementary schools, TIES, is a classroom-level intervention program designed to bring trauma-informed services to early elementary," end quote. The pilot study had good results, and a more rigorous second study showed that, quote, "the TIES classroom showed significant improvements, while no significant improvements were observed in non-TIES classrooms across both data sets," end quote. TIES uses the Attachment, Self-Regulation, and Competency, otherwise known as ARC, model as its foundation. This is represented through 10 building blocks, which, quote, "represent specific intervention targets and, as a whole, provide an organizational framework for developing and implementing intervention approaches that address the comprehensive nature of trauma," end quote. Chabone explains further that, quote, "the attachment building blocks addresses factors needed to build a healthy and safe relationship between the child and caregiving system that can buffer the impact of traumatic stressors. The self-regulation building blocks target a child's awareness and understanding of internal experience, ability to modulate that experience, and ability to safely share that experience with others. The competency building blocks address social connection, community involvement, and academic engagement," end quote. TIES works by, quote, "providing classrooms with a resource liaison to support teachers in recognizing and responding to trauma indicators. These liaisons are master-level licensed therapists and work with both staff, students, and their families. They ensure school environments are trauma-informed and optimal for development. Also, they, quote, link behavioral health services at school and in the home to develop a comprehensive and consistent intervention plan, end quote. The TIES model has been used in 2 studies, and both found great success with the model. In fact, quote, TIES classrooms demonstrated a significant increase from the beginning of the school year, baseline, to the end of the school year, follow-up, in emotional support, classroom organization, and instructional support, while no such improvements were observed in comparison classrooms, end quote. However, Tabone et al. Pointed out in their paper that although the 2 studies support the method, more research needs to be done. They suggest a randomized controlled trial to better understand the benefits of the TIES model. Next, let's discuss another trauma-informed care model called Head Start Trauma Start. Holmes et al.'s paper describes Head Start Trauma Smart, HSTS, an early education/mental health cross-systems partnership designed to work within the child's natural setting. The goal of HSTS is to create an integrated, trauma-informed culture for young children, parents, and staff. The HSTS program emphasizes tools and skills that can be applied in everyday settings, end quote. The program was designed for inner-city kids, many from low-income families and with complex trauma. HTST used 3 frameworks in their program. These were the Attachment, Self-Regulation, and Competency Model, also known as ARC, Trauma-Focused Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, TFCBT, and Early Childhood Mental Health Consultations. The program itself consists of 4 parts. First, the therapist would train everyone involved in caring for the child, including everyone from bus drivers to grandparents, using the ARC model. Then, if the child met, quote, criteria based on the Achenbach Teacher Report Form /CBCL and Childhood Trust Event Survey, end quote, they could receive, quote, intensive individual trauma-focused intervention, end quote, using TFCBT. Third, therapists could provide classroom consultation, quote, to all teachers and children as requested or needed, regardless of whether or not a child in the classroom was receiving intensive individual treatment, end quote. This assists the teacher in implementing trauma-informed care in the classroom. Lastly, was peer mentoring available for staff and parents to help them build skills. As one can tell from these components, the program prioritizes involving the whole community. This creates, quote, consistent plan of action for caretakers who are in frequent contact with the children. Thus, a child in need does not have to wait for time with the therapist to receive trauma-based support. Parents may also experience secondary trauma as a result of the child's trauma. Therefore, they can apply the skills and training to themselves, end quote. This helps the entire community, which is vital because many adults experience trauma without ever receiving help. However, Tabone et al. Points out that it is difficult to say if HSTS was effective or not because it was, quote, limited to only Head Start children. The HSTS evaluation used a single group design that only included the intervention group, end quote. Because there was no control group used in the study, it is difficult to fully evaluate the data. Lastly, let's explore school-wide positive behavior interventions and supports, SWPBIS. Whereas HSTS has problems with evaluating the program, SWPBIS does not. This is because it was developed with a goal to help, quote, build a strong evidence base, end quote. This is important as children with trauma from the ages of 0 to 6 are, quote, underserved in research and practice, yet maltreatment is particularly prevalent and devastating to this population of children, end quote. Therefore, it is very important for research on trauma-informed care for these children to have strong studies with replicable results. SWPBIS is one example of, quote, multi-tiered frameworks of service delivery built on foundations involving early identification of risk, varied levels of intervention, support designed to teach skills and prevent more serious problems, and continual data-driven evaluations of response, end quote. Sheffield stresses the importance of meticulous planning of trauma-informed care programs because unlike other models, which focus on the child in isolation, They involve the child, their family, the school, and other parts of the community. Additionally, SWP-BIS uses data, quote, routinely used to identify problems early and monitor response to increasingly intensive services to address needs, end quote. In contrast, in older models, students must first be individually referred and assessed in order to receive supports. Newer models, such as SWP-BIS, are better because they can address students' needs before larger problems arise and help more of the population. One specific way SWP-BIS does this is by categorizing children into 3 tiers, with Tier 1 representing the lowest support needs and Tier 3 representing the highest support needs. Tier 1 focuses on, quote, supporting all students through fostering a positive environment and teaching tools that would help all students. Tier 2 is, quote, for at-risk students and may include psychoeducation on recognition of trauma signs and impact, as well as the strengthening of self-regulation skills, end quote. Lastly, Tier 3 addresses students needing the most support and uses cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. This includes TFCBT, Cognitive Behavioral Intervention for Trauma in Schools, CBITS, which is for groups and individuals, Grief and Trauma Intervention, GTI, and Multimodal Trauma Treatment, MMTT. Programs like these are so important because, quote, referrals for school-based mental health services have been shown to be more successful than referrals to community agencies, end quote. However, Shafoulias emphasizes that such programs can only reach their full potential when they're carefully planned, quote, to support accurate, durable, and scalable implementation in schools. As you can see from the information I have shared, it is imperative for early childhood educators to become knowledgeable about early childhood trauma and to integrate trauma-informed practices in the classroom. Furthermore, this must happen on a school-wide scale, not just in individual classrooms. If this doesn't occur, children will continue to suffer. Although a system-wide change would be costly, it ultimately could be less expensive than leaving the problem as it is. This is because early childhood trauma affects nearly all social services, from the judicial system, foster care system, and healthcare system. It is the responsibility of not only educators, but all members of society to ensure that children are safe and well, and creating trauma-sensitive schools is an important part of this. Thank you.